The air was wet inside my mask, heavy and humid. It was hard for me to breathe, to see. Every exhalation mixing with the flowers and spices and fogging the small crystal lenses set to see out of. The repugnant smell was suffocating, but it was better than the alternative. A finely woven and beaded talisman hung from the narrow beak. It was said that it would protect against curses, sickness, and of course, the wilt. It didn't save the dozens of searchers I had joined with, though. The history books were littered with tales of myth and magic, but they were nothing more than tales. The so-called gods that granted such powers had long since abandoned mankind. I still tie it on every morning, though. I don't know if it's superstition or just a habit at this point, but I figured it couldn't hurt. The street felt wrong. They always felt wrong. Smoke and dust filled the air of the smoldering town, which I didn't bother to learn the name of. Most of the bodies I passed were wilted past the point of recognition, then burned to boot. The flames usually dealt with any lingering shades, but staying alert had saved more lives than any talisman. I stopped near a body that was still somewhat intact. The setting sun lit the fog alight with an ominous red glow, just bright enough to illuminate the corpse, collapsed against the deteriorated wall of an alley nearby. I lowered my pull torch in that direction. The flickering flame on the end of the 6-foot staff cast shadows that moved and danced with life. The body was the right size. It could be. But no, she wouldn't have come this far south. I knelt down in front of the lifeless form. Its legs were nothing but dust, and half of its head had caved in, showing the hollow husk that was left. The cracked gray and white skin flaked and fell away like petals from what used to be a mouth, blown away from the gust of wind my cloak had sent when I knelt down. Sights like those always made my stomach crawl. The dried-out eyes, no hint of color. The cracked and flaking skin. The distorted and broken remnants of what was once a human being. They looked vaguely female, but it was nearly impossible to tell. But it wasn't her. I knew it wasn't. I became a searcher for the same reason as most. I was looking for someone, but hoping deep down that I would never find them. I stood up slowly, letting my stomach settle. Then I held out my torch and pressed it into the corpse's breathless chest. The chest sunk in at the heat, collapsing in on itself. A low guttural croak escaped from her broken lips, flakes of the strange ash-like substance floating out. The wilt didn't kill those it infected. It consumed them slowly, tearing them apart, flake by flake, petal by petal, wilting and fading away until nothing but a shade of their soul remained. The terrible disease had spread like a storm across Elias. There was no god to save them, no empire to shield them. Such ideals had faded away like a wilted husk. The wilt didn't destroy the empire. The empire did that itself. But the wilt bloomed on what came after. Chaos. The woman's croak rose to a low scream, then a growl. Her arm jittered and jerked upwards like on a rusty hinge, reaching towards me. But her hand crumbled to dust before it made it that far. The fire burned bright and hot as it destroyed her body and soul. People far smarter than I have said that fire doesn't normally destroy a person's soul. But it sure as the veil does the trick on the wilt. The last groans of the woman's death rattle left her lips, and her trembling body fell still. I breathed out a long human breath, causing my mask to fog up again. Then I stepped away. I pulled out my slate to make yet another mark. Then a tall building caught my eye in the otherwise collapsed town. You see, the wilt didn't just destroy flesh. Wood, soil, and even stone withered and fell away under its corruption. And what the wilt didn't destroy, the flames usually did. The building was a church of some kind, Brokeen architecture from the look, though any religious buildings from the Empire that survived through the Blood Wars had long since been repurposed. I moved towards the imposing structure. Its spires disappeared into the cloud of smoke and ash that hung low over the town. The steel veins and supports running throughout like bones most likely prevented the worst effects of the wilt. Though the wilt could destroy even steel, the process took much longer than other materials. As I moved through the doors, the sheer number of bodies crowded in the small area nearly stopped my heart. Dozens upon dozens, piled together and on top of each other, fleeing the wilt and then the flames. Dozens of people, praying to gods that would never answer them. The shepherd's crooks hanging on the walls noted this congregation as belonging to the flock, a strange offshoot religion from the Blood Wars, incorporating Brokeen structure with Chromian zealotry. It all seemed so pointless to me. How could any god with a semblance of power allow something as terrible as the wilt to ravage their followers? What kind of god could subject their adherents to such tortures? I realized long ago that the gods, if they existed at all, didn't give a damn about us. Despite the grim nature of our work, most searchers held some form of religious belief or another. They say it helps them cope, helps them believe there's some meaning to all of this suffering. But I can't. There is no meaning, no plan, only death and suffering. I suppose that only leaves Crom, the god of death. Death is the only mercy we can offer these poor souls, after all. The sound of whispered breaths and muffled screams oozed from the piles of withered flesh. The faces of everyone I've ever lost flashed throughout those corpses. My own breaths grew ragged. The corpse nearest to me reached out a flaky hand that disintegrated to the bone as it stretched towards me. That face. I knew that face. That boy. He was the first I ever killed. The two faces behind him belonged to my parents. The first people I went searching for and wished to any god who would listen that I never found. Their screams grew louder, a deafening roar of death and pain. Traitor, coward, murderer, they called. My heart threatened to beat out of my chest. I stumbled backwards, looking from face to face. Not her face. Never her face. The crystal lenses of my mask fogged as I hyperventilated. My pull torch clattered to the ground, and I stumbled backwards over something, only to be caught just before I hit the ground. The arms gripped my shoulders harder than any shade should have the strength for. I couldn't pull away. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. My vision grew dark.
Atrem!
A woman's voice called. Was it her? No, it couldn't be.
Atrem, stop fighting me!
But I did know that voice, didn't I? Leren. I almost tore my mask off so that I could breathe, but my training, limited as it was, kicked in and stopped me. I shut my eyes and forced my breathing to calm. Deep breaths. In. Out. Calm. The long beak of her mask hung over my shoulder, the talisman at the tip dangling below. She slowly loosened her grip and helped me to my feet, keeping her eyes on the mass of groaning bodies. The shades were waking. I cautiously reached for my pull torch and prepared for the worst.
Go, I'll handle this,
she said, her words muffled by her mask. I hesitated.
Go,
she insisted. I stumbled out of the small church filled with dead, as she pulled flares from her oversized supply pack, lit them on her pole torch, and tossed them into the heap. The choir of cursed souls cried out in unholy worship as the flames spread to engulf their wilted husks. There were no gods to save them. If any beings of great power did dwell in the other world, they weren't gods. They were cowards. Cowards like me. Ash and wilted petals fell from the thick fog overhead like snow from the northern steppe. The sun finally tucked down below Apis. As it rose from the horizon, the blood-red haze from its light faded away. I had heard that Clades was supposed to jump spheres during the alignment. Great. Just what we needed. The damage would be minimal due to the lack of oceans on Elias, but Elias was the smallest of the spheres, and the dead moon's orbit was never a good omen. I sighed deeply, once again fogging my mask. I had frozen before. We all had. This job. It did things to our minds, our souls. The nightmares we had were just as bad while waking as they were while we slept. Perhaps some handled it better than I have, but I've yet to meet them. Leren exited the church, smoke billowing out behind her, adding its volume to the fog. She walked over to me.
Atrem, are you all right?
She asked, not even bothering to use Tor, my birth prefix. Most people forewent them these days. With the mortality rate so high, family dynamics changed so rapidly. It was hard to keep up. I hadn't heard from my 2 elder brothers since before I joined the search. For all I knew, I could be the only Atrem left.
Yeah,
I mumbled.
Well, you know. I'm okay now, though. Thank you.
Don't mention it. Call for backup before you go into a gathering place next time, yeah?
Yeah.
She glanced around, then nodded towards me.
I'm headed to the north end. I'll stay in earshot.
She moved to go, but hesitated, and turned back to me.
You sure you're all right?
I'm all right, Leren. I promise.
She held my gaze for a long moment, despite neither of us being able to see the other's eyes, then nodded again and headed off. She was a good searcher. Determined, fearless. The wilt hadn't broken her yet. But it would. It always did. She was one of the countless women who had become searchers. In fact, most searchers were female, looking for their fathers, husbands, sons. Leren was looking for her brother, still hoping he's alive and well somewhere. But we are not searchers of the living. She would learn that lesson on her own. It wasn't my place to teach her that part. Akron Audio presents, in association with Woad Digital, Searchers. Written and directed by James Victor. Performed by James Victor, Ashley Thomas, Weeb Trash Audio, and Lil Blue. I hope that you will enjoy this story. If you do, please leave a like and a comment. I would really appreciate it. To stay up to date on when new stories are released, feel free to subscribe and click the notification bell. Without further ado, I implore that you listen and enjoy. We made it to the ridge, looking out over the next town by morning. We could still barely see the plume of smoke from the last town miles below. It was colder up here. It felt like home. The ridgeline overlooked a sprawling forest, with a small clearing made for the settlement down by the frozen river. The wools and furs we wore took the edge out of the cold, but each breath still stabbed my lungs with pain. Though the masks would be warmer, Leren and I both cherished every moment we didn't have to wear the bloody things. She wore her short hair in a tight bun, ready to replace her mask at any moment. Her narrow yellow eyes peered out over the forest, weighing the sight cautiously. Her stern demeanor and hard features would prevent most from calling her beautiful, but she had a certain charm, I supposed. Though these were hardly the right times to think about such things. A search partner was the closest thing any of us had to a friend, but I'd learned not to make such attachments. She hadn't yet. Despite her bold and stern nature, she still cared deeply, even for me. She breathed out a plume of vapor in the cold wind. I hated myself for it, but I looked closely at that fog, checking to see any petals of ash escaping her lungs. It was one of the first signs of the wilt, followed by a dry cough as it worked its way through the lungs. Then the extremities, starting with the fingers and toes, would begin to lose feeling and color. It would then spread inward from there and outward from the chest. The last to fade was the eyes and the mind, allowing the infected to witness every last second until it left them a pale corpse, flesh blowing away in the wind. I've heard it's a painless process. I feel like that almost makes it worse. Thankfully, I saw no petals in her breath. It was just a breath, a sign that despite all odds she was still alive, like me. She glanced towards me, her eyes searching.
You don't seem to mind the cold,
she said. I simply grunted in response.
Where did you grow up?
It's not wise to ask those questions, Leren.
But I've told you all about me, where I'm from, who I'm searching for.
I wish you hadn't. She scoffed wryly and returned her gaze outwards, an indignant smile on her face. Look, I've known too many search partners. I've lost too many search partners. It's easier this way. Trust me. Her eyes fell to the unlit pole torch in her hand.
Fine. Have it your way.
She took a final deep breath of fresh air and slid the bird-like mask over her head. We would have to replace the flowers and spice soon, though our supplies were beginning to run low.
Coming?
She asked, walking away. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath as well. The cold still stung, but I savored it as if it were my last. It very well could be. I raised the mask to my face, and its darkness surrounded me. My senses were assaulted by the malodorous smell, a smell I associated with death and pain. Then I followed after her. The dull green-yellow color of the grass faded to brown and deep green, and the sparse trees turned to dense evergreen forest. The white ash-like substance of the wilt stood in sharp contrast with the dark overgrowth as it corrupted its way outward from the town. The strange blood-colored roses that always bloomed in the wilt's wake dotted the landscape. It was always odd to me that everything the wilt touched turned gray and white and withered away, except for those roses. It was like the roses took all the color and life for themselves and left everything else to fall away. The town was smaller than the previous, and most of the buildings were still standing, though they were all stacked close together in rows. The wilt here was still somewhat fresh, but it worked quickly once it took hold. Every surface was dull white or gray, like a grayscale painting. The wilted petals had just started falling from the sky after tearing off from the nearby buildings or being kicked up by the wind. The place was eerily quiet as we made our way to the first street. I stopped at the mouth of the haunted place, and Leren stopped beside me. She knew the routine by now. She gestured her head towards the right side of the townhouses. I nodded in reply, then went to the row mirrored on the left. The process was simple. Enter each building, check for signs of shades or infection. If there were any, deal with them, then burn it all to the ground. They always screamed when you burned them. Whether it was a remnant of their soul trying to fight off death, the wilt itself exerting some form of consciousness at being destroyed, or a natural bodily response, I had no idea. But the screams, they haunted me. Haunted us all. There were 3 bodies in the corners of the first house. Their clothes hadn't fully fallen away yet, and though their skin was ashen and their eyes milky, their flesh had yet to crumble or flake away. It was always harder when they still looked human. They didn't put up much of a fight. The wilt never actually fought back until it had fully destroyed a body, leaving only the shade. The further the body deteriorated, the more they would fight back, oddly enough. But these were fresh. The last one, a young boy, almost still had a hint of color in his eyes as I rammed my burning pole torch into his chest. Wilted flesh burned like paper, and their screams cut like razors. I moved through the houses one after another, granting the only mercy left to the souls forgotten here. Hearing the screams, as painful as it was part of our job. There would be nothing left of these people, due to the flames or the wilt running its course. No one to remember who these people were, or the lives they lived. Remembering their final screams felt like it was the least I could do. And remember them I would. Every last one. I couldn't forget them, even if I tried. And trust me, I tried. I exited a burning building, a few embers lighting on the fringe of my cloak, and nodded to Leren, who had just come out of one on the other side, a plume of smoke following her. Then I entered the largest building in the row, situated in the center of town. The opening foyer was wide, and what furniture hadn't crumbled apart yet was intricate and ornate. It displayed an air of wealth that was absent in the other buildings. Perhaps a wealthy trader or government official? It didn't really matter. It all wilted the same. I froze when I heard a noise from the second floor. Small wilted petals fluttered down from the once wooden support beams overhead. The noise continued. A low thump followed by a dull creak, almost as if... I moved towards the staircase that wrapped around the far corner of the building, eyes fixed on the top of that staircase, and careful not to make much noise myself. Full shades hardly had any real substance to them, and should be unable to influence the environment to create a noise like that. But certain animals, when infected, could become violent. It was best to be cautious. I ascended the stairs one step at a time until I came into full view of the second floor. In the center of the large room was a man, walking slowly in tight circles. Only tattered and wilted rags covered his starved form. His arms were grayed to the elbows, and his hair had all but fallen out. I lowered my pole torch in his direction, watching for any sudden moves. He rounded the far side of the circle that he had worn into the floor, and lifted his head and noticed me. His eyes widened in surprise.
"Oh, by the blood! You've come for me. I had almost given up hope,"
the man exclaimed.
Who are you?
He stared at me for a moment, confused.
"I'm the mayor of this town, of course. Cousin to the prefect. He sent you to rescue me, did he not?"
The prefect had died when the wilt had all but destroyed the regional capital. The wilt didn't care for politics or borders.
He did not.
I moved closer to the man, the torch still lowered towards him.
"Oh, then why are you here?"
His eyes glanced downwards, just now noticing the torch in my hands. Then they flicked back up to my mask-covered face.
"You're a searcher of the dead. Of course, I should have known."
His posture slouched and his eyes fell to the floor.
"Well,"
he said, regaining his composure and motioning towards his body.
"as you can see, I am not dead. The gods have spared me from the wilt's destruction."
Wilted petals and dust motes bloomed from his mouth as he spoke, then began to cough.
How long have you been walking in circles?
He looked nervous, probably fearful of what I would do if I deemed he was infected, which he clearly was.
4 days.
It was a clever tactic. Constant motion and movement could curb the worst effects of the wilt, if not for long. In the end, however, it simply prolonged the inevitable. Once the wilt progressed far enough, it would cruelly keep the infected alive throughout the entire process, regardless of food, water, or injury, though most would succumb to it long before they would even need to worry about such things. I once heard a search report of a messenger who survived for weeks after being infected, without realizing. His constant movement prevented the corruption, and he found himself no longer needing to eat, drink, or even sleep. This, of course, made him even more efficient at his job. The report ended with records of the hundreds of towns he had inadvertently spread his infection to without realizing. At some point, he must have realized that truth, because when a searcher finally caught up to him, she found that he had self-immolated to prevent further spread. The mayor tried to make a run for the stairs. I left him broken and burning, trying to ignore the look of terror still on his face. He couldn't feel the pain, but he could still feel fear. I returned outside. Leren had just cleared another building as well, and must have been able to read my mood from my posture.
Shade?
She asked.
No. A live one.
Her shoulders sank. She understood how it felt to extinguish a life like that. We always convinced ourselves that what we were doing was a mercy. But was it merciful to him? A man who wanted to keep fighting, who wanted to keep living. Did it matter?
I'm sorry.
She said with solemnity. I simply shrugged my shoulders and moved on. The needles of the forest bristled, then rattled as a strong and frigid gust of wind tore through the town, kicking up dust and wilted petals in its wake. The world turned white and gray. The cold bit through my thick wool and fur clothes, sending shivers across my body. The crystal lenses of my mask fogged and began to frost over due to the sudden temperature change. Not that I could see anything regardless. I moved slowly in the direction of the center street, and heard Leren's voice above the howl of wind.
Atrem?
Yeah.
I called back.
Is this normal?
Yeah.
Elias was a cold place. Everyone knew that, but most people live further south, where the temperature was warmer and the weather more forgiving. We were in the north now, near my home. The barren steppe was cold and windy, but the fir trees Elias was known for grew only in massive forests within canyons like this one. Canyons like massive cracks in the sphere itself, covering the northern and southern lands like a spider's web. These canyons would also turn into violent wind tunnels whenever a storm was approaching. A hand grabbed my arm with a firm grip, pulling me deeper into the whiteout, then through a doorway into a small room of an adjacent building. Leren slammed the door behind her, sending quakes throughout the building. Dust shook free from the rafters, and petals fell from the walls. Then everything was silent and dark, except for the howling white outside the windows. She walked to the far side of the small room, and peered through the only doorway into another room beyond. After making sure it was clear, she returned and leaned against a wall near me, resting her pull torch against her shoulder. I stood there, a dull sense of emptiness still spreading throughout my body like the wilt itself after killing that man. A low sizzle broke through the howling wind outside. We both turned to the wall this building shared with the previous one Leren had cleared. A black ring expanded from the center of the blank wall near the floor, then an orange glow followed it. Numerous other spots of char and ember appeared as the wind stoked the fire from the surrounding buildings, eating through the one we currently occupied.
Scars.
She swore under her breath.
I don't know about you, but I'd rather face the wind.
Fine.
She shoved past me and threw the door open into the whiteout. What wilt was left to be blown away should pass soon. Then visibility would clear. I followed her out into the gale and to what I assumed was the center of the street. As I had suspected, the whiteout began to fade, as the last of the loose wilt was carried away to spread its infection elsewhere. After a few moments, the street was clear, and the wind started to die down, leaving only passing howls in the distance. The street was bare. Half of the buildings we had set ablaze were blown away in the gust. Nothing moved. The stillness was eerie after such a tempest. I looked towards the far end of the town and saw her. No, it wasn't her. But it was someone. A small girl, no more than 12 years old, standing in the middle of the street. She wore a ragged black cloak over her shoulders that draped down, covering her entire body. I reached out my hand and grabbed Leren's shoulder, who was a few steps to my side. She jerked her head around, and I pointed out the strange sight. The girl's skin and hair were as pale as the wilt around her. From this distance I couldn't make out any other details, but for some reason I couldn't quite put my finger on. The sight unnerved me, more than anything I had encountered in my time as a searcher. Leren and I glanced towards one another, then back at the strange girl. I took a cautious step towards her, and Leren followed my lead, step after painfully slow step. The girl didn't move. Her hair didn't even move in the wind. Not that there was any wind to move it now, come to think of it. She just stood there.
She wasn't there before, was she?
Leren asked.
Not that I recall.
She's clearly wilted.
But not her clothes.
I don't like this.
Be ready.
For what?
Running, fighting, anything.
Yeah, right. Okay.
We came within about 10 paces of the child, our pull torches raised in a defensive posture. We were close enough to see her face now. Despite the discoloration, it was remarkably well preserved, and her eyes were black as night. Oh gods. My heart fell, staring into those infinite pits of darkness. Wilted eyes were always milky white. Always. What was this girl? She tilted her head to the side at a slight angle, then unhinged her jaw and let out a terrible cry, like those of the wilted before they became shades, but 1,000 times more horrible. Leren and I both backed away from the terrible sound. It felt as though it should be coming from the maw of some horrific monster, not this small child. Then I understood. After so long battling the wilt, it had begun to feel like a force of nature, a terrible disease that had spread to consume all life. But it wasn't natural at all, was it? Legends claimed that the wilt was a Faden, cursed demons from the Vale, horrific monsters that wanted nothing more than to destroy and consume. I always thought such tales were myths, like those of the gods, but staring into those black, lifeless eyes, hearing that awful call, I believed. Among tales of the Faden were stories of people who were fully possessed by the creatures and cursed to do their bidding.
A host.
I whispered under the deafening scream.
What?
She's a host. For the wilt.
Leren stared at me for a moment.
Okay, so what do we do?
Another voice from behind us joined with the cry of the small girl, harmonizing death rattles, calling out in a language only the dead could understand. Then a second scream came from the alleyway to our left, a third, a fourth, a dozen terrible voices calling out in an awful chorus of pain and death. Petals of wilt began to rise up of their own accord, forming the rough, if distorted outline of humans.
Are those shades?
She asked. I often forgot how new she was to this. This may have been the first time she had seen a full shade.
Run!
I yelled, then pulled her by the arm to the right. Streams of wilted petals flew through the air like leaves on the wind, heading towards us. One column landed directly ahead of us at the mouth of an alleyway that led towards the town's outskirts. The petals fanned out as the flow crashed into the ground. Then, like emerging from water, a not quite human figure arose from the ground, made of dust and wilt. Every child had heard stories of ghosts when they were little, but few ever imagined they would actually see one in the flesh. Well, not the flesh, I suppose. Without thinking, I plunged my pole torch forward towards the shade's chest, and the countless petals that made up its form burst into flame. Shades weren't difficult to kill, but they had a tendency to swarm, and if they got their hands on you, then you were as good as dead yourself. We pushed further down the alley, screams still sounding behind us. Shades flooded the mouth near the street, and two popped up just in front of us. The first lunged for me, but Leren, though inexperienced, was fast on her feet, and caught the creature's head with the flaming brand of her pole torch. I thrust my own torch towards the second, but it burst apart before I could make contact, its petals swirling past us and reforming right behind Leren.
Behind!
I shouted. Not having enough time to swing her pole back around, Leren pulled a flare from her sleeve, striking it against the alley wall, which left a trail of smoldering embers, and rammed it into the shade's chest. It burned and screamed. Then she wound her arm back and hurled the flare towards the alley entrance. Neither of us waited around to see the result of that flare. Instead, we sprinted for the far end. We burst out of the alley and over a short stone wall, then down a slope towards the half-frozen river the town was built beside.
Now what?
She called. Frantic desperation was clear on her tongue. We both looked around, as if for some savior to descend from the other world.
The river,
I responded. She looked down at the frigid waters, then up at me. Though I couldn't see her facial expressions behind the mask, I got the distinct feeling that she thought I was insane. A cloud of wilt and dust poured out of the alley we had just left. We had only put around 100 paces between it and us.
They shouldn't follow us into the river. Wilt dissolves in water.
Water wouldn't destroy the wilt. It would form a kind of silt, as opposed to its usual form. But the shade wouldn't be able to animate if it was submerged. Or so I hoped.
We'll freeze to death.
It was a valid point. More valid than I wanted to think about at that moment.
Maybe. But unless you think we can fight off 100 shades, I think it's our best chance.
She looked back up the hill, and we both watched as the cloud materialized into a near army of shades. I didn't count to confirm if there really were 100, but I think it was a close enough estimation. Without further prompting, she took off towards the water in a sprint and leapt into the frozen waves, the brand of her torch winking out with a hiss. We were already soaked and half frozen, making our way north towards the next town when the storm hit. Sheets of frozen water pelted our drenched furs and wool, icy needles stabbing through the thick clothing. The day had grown dark despite the time. Storms like these would halt the wilt for a while, but they could be almost as deadly for the unprepared. We only made it halfway there before we both agreed to try and wait out the storm. Our shivering and chattering teeth almost sounded louder than the torrential downpour and thunder. It was the kind of bitter cold that made one forget they had ever known warmth before. Setting up our small tent was a painstaking ordeal. Thankfully, due to the rain and the river, we wouldn't need to clean any wilt off of our clothes. Unfortunately, it also meant a fire would be nearly impossible. Our flares were thoroughly soaked through, and we had nothing dry to use as kindling. The single pair of camp clothes we each had were equally drenched, so we both settled down in opposite ends of the tent, not daring to even remove our masks for the small amount of protection from the cold they would provide.
We'll have to go back, you know,
she said through chattering teeth over the storm.
I know.
What do we do if she's still there?
She won't be. The rain will weaken the wilt for a while. But she should have moved on by now. Chasing us, probably. Or moving to the next town.
Without another word, we braced to ride out the storm in misery. Tomorrow's problems would worry about themselves. I awoke sometime later. I had no idea how much time had passed. I was a fool. I knew better than to fall asleep in cold like this. But thankfully, I was still breathing. The rain had let off some, it seemed. But night had also fallen outside. Frost had fully covered the lenses of my mask, and I struggled to undo the rigid straps with frozen fingers. Fingers that had begun to lose their color. Hopefully that was due to frostbite, and not the wilt. A sobering thought that someone would wish for frostbite. I finally removed the bird-beaked mask. The spices and flowers inside had taken on the smell of mildew and rot. I took a deep breath, and the air once again stung my lungs with a dull pain, causing me to cough sharply. I glanced over to the pile of fur and wool that was Leren, resting a few feet away. That pile didn't move. I was a damned fool. I crawled over to her. No movement, no shiver, no motion from her rising chest. No, not again. Not like this. I shook her body with both hands, praying to a god I didn't even believe in that she was still alive. Please, not like this. I fumbled with the straps of her mask, my fingers struggling to bend, to feel. I pulled it away from her face. It was pale and nearly blue. The tip of her nose had turned a dark gray. No. I reached out, pulling her collar away from her neck, ripping the furs and tearing the wool shirt open. I felt for warmth on her chest and neck, though my hands were frozen themselves. I felt something. I felt for a pulse, closing my eyes, steadying my own breathing and heart rate. I put my head to her chest, listening for something. Anything. There. I gasped and nearly cried out at the faint thump. It was quiet. Too quiet. Too slow. I shook her more, trying to wake her up. She was alive, but wouldn't be for very long. Wake up, damn it! Her eye fluttered. Slow and almost imperceptible. I kept shaking. The smallest slit open, her yellow eye rolled just slightly. Leren, listen to me. You have to wake up. A soft groan came from deep within her chest. I pushed the damp furs off her shoulders, then tore the rest of her woolen shirt away, followed by her thick trousers, revealing her bare body underneath. I paused for a second, noting the countless scars and burns covering her strong, yet too pale body. Those same burns were mirrored on my own body, but it still brought me pain to see them on her. You don't play with fire without getting burnt. I hastily removed my own clothes and laid down beside her, pulling her cold body into mine. It was like hugging a block of ice. I pulled what remained of our damp furs over us, trying to trap in what little body heat remained. Minutes passed, painfully frigid minutes, then an hour. I began to lose what little feeling I had left in my fingers and toes. I tried to keep moving, rubbing her back with my arms. I couldn't tell if she was getting warmer or if I was getting colder. Another hour. An eternity. She groaned. The sudden noise startled me.
Atrem?
Stay with me, Leren.
What are you?
She managed to whisper out, slow and slurred. Stay awake. Don't you dare fall back to sleep.
Hot. I'm too hot.
Her body began to squirm in slow, painful motions. I pulled her in tighter, forcing her to still. Listen to me, Leren. I shouted. Both of her eyes struggled to flutter open. They were unable to focus. Listen to me. I need you to stay awake. I need you to stay with me. Listen to my voice. Except, I had nothing to say. I had always been a man of few words. I kept my thoughts and my past close. I grew up near here, I began to say. I didn't like talking about my past. It hurt too much. But my half-frozen mind couldn't think of anything else. Her yellow eyes fought to focus on mine, mere inches away. A town, just to the north. The next on our list, if I'm correct. It was small, cold, but it was home. I felt her body quiver as a chill washed over her. Good. Shivering was a good sign at this stage. My parents were traders. The town would harvest the lumber from the forest and the minerals from the mines, and my parents would travel all over to sell them. I was a third son, cursed from birth, if the legends were to be believed. But I never felt cursed. Not before, at least. An image came to my mind unbidden. A smile. A head of long, wavy black hair. Eyes deeper and greener than the forest itself. Even laying bare next to another woman, her breasts against my chest. My only thoughts were of her. There was a girl, the daughter of the lumber miller. She had the kind of smile that could bring light and warmth to even the darkest and coldest Elysian night. I smiled to myself, remembering growing up together, remembering the times we spent playing pranks on my brothers, or wandering through the forest, dreaming of other spheres, remembering the first night we spent together, sharing in a love neither of us could have ever imagined, remembering our wedding feast and the flowers in her hair. She meant everything to me. Leren's eyes were fully open now, staring deeply into my own. A first daughter and a third son rarely wed, but we didn't care. Perhaps I should have. She lifted a shivering hand and placed it gently on my face.
What happened?
She asked unsteadily. My parents went to the regional capital for trade, and never returned. Both my older brothers went in search of them, but they vanished as well. Months had passed before the first searchers arrived in our town. They explained that the wilt had carved a path of destruction across Elias, and they needed more searchers to help seek out the dead and halt the spread. They called for every third daughter and son that could be spared. Being married, I didn't have to go. I could have stayed. But I needed to know what had happened to my parents. I paused, forcing down unwanted emotions that sprang up of that time. Leren's nearly blackened thumb rubbed my face softly, a deep sadness in her eyes. She knew what was coming. I found their wilted husks a few weeks later. I should have left the search then, but I hadn't heard any word from my brothers. After what I had to do to my own parents, I felt so empty, so hollow. How could I return to a loving wife and a happy home after what I had done? A tear rolled down Leren's face, and much to my surprise, I felt one at the corner of my own eye. So I kept searching. It's been 2 years since I left. I've killed hundreds. Lost 13 search partners to the wilt. Vale, I almost lost you to my own foolishness. Maybe I am cursed after all. A moment of silence passed between us. I could feel her body against mine, heat returning to it slowly. I reached up and removed her hand from my face and tried to rub some warmth back into it. I didn't know if the fingers could be saved at this point, but the least I could do was try. I heard news that the wilt was spreading north, so I offered to join the northern search. And, well, you know the rest. Every wilted town we passed, every step closer we've come to home. An unavoidable dread has been building up inside of me. Knowing what I will find. Wondering if I have the strength to do what I need to. She looked down at our hands as I rubbed them together, breathing hot air onto them.
I'm sorry, Atrem.
Me too.
I don't believe you're cursed. If it wasn't for you, I would be dead right now.
Her eyes met mine once again. I looked away. Yes, I had saved her life, but I was also the one who had endangered it in the first place, suggesting that we cross the river and then falling asleep like I did. But I knew she was just trying to make me feel better, so I accepted her praise for what it was. I met her eyes again and forced a small smile. I placed her hands under my armpits, as it was one of the warmest places of the body. She looked curious at first, but understood once she felt the warmth, then turned her head and snuggled down against my chest. I held her close throughout the night, forcing myself to stay awake. Our heat continued to feed off of each other, until it was almost a comfortable temperature. She dozed off again at some point, but I could feel her heartbeat, her breath, hear a soft snore escape her nose, and see the color in her face. I knew she was safe for now. I may not be able to protect my family, my love. But right now I could protect Leren, and offer her what little peace was left to people like us. Not that her sleep wouldn't be plagued with nightmares like my own were, but still. The storm had fully passed during the night. Light crept in through the canvas tent, illuminating the space with a soft golden glow. I slowly removed myself from under the furs and dressed. I was able to get a fire going outside the tent, to boil some water and heat some rocks to keep Leren warm until she woke. I dumped the soggy mess out of our masks and washed them out. Then I sifted through our supplies. Much of the flowers and spices for our masks had been ruined or washed away by the river. Our food supplies didn't fare much better, but I wouldn't be needing food anymore. I pulled out my slate board and removed a thin slate from the binding, making some notes and instructions for Leren. Then, with one last look at her sleeping peacefully, I journeyed off towards my fate. The shape of the town was exactly as I remembered it. A clump of small buildings and homes, with a large lumber mill by the water. The colors, of course, were very off. The once vibrant buildings and gardens were nothing but dull gray and white, the only color coming from the hundreds of blood-red roses in the white field outside. I had expected as much, but seeing it was different. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No clothes or sheets blew in the wind. No children played in the streets. Not a single thing moved. The only sounds I heard were from the river or distant birds in the forest. Even they knew to stay away from a place like this. I coughed against the cold air. No pain in my lungs this time. I put on my mask, for the first time not being accosted by the terrible stench of near rotten flowers and spices, then walked into the town. The first few bodies I found near the outskirts were still well preserved, eyes milky white, or at least almost so, but their minds and bodies had already fallen to the wilt. Nashan, the farmer, his wife and 2 boys. I dealt with the parents first. No father should have to watch his children die, even if he was already taken by the wilt. Sar Groten, the blacksmith, whose furnace had long since gone cold, and his elderly father. The latter had withered away more than the former. The aged often wilted first. So were Reven, the seamstress. Most others were unrecognizable. Their homes and bodies smoldered and burned. The smoke filled my mask despite sealing it the best I could. The stench of burning wilt and flesh made me cough and gag. I exited the small mercantile that my parents had helped supply after dealing with the handful of wilted patrons huddled within. At the entrance to the town where I had come from, a small figure caught my eye. A small girl with white hair and a black cloak. Good. Leren would have an easier time cleaning up the previous town without the host there. But I wasn't here for the girl. I turned away from the child and moved down the street towards my home. I had been a lumberman before I left, and she worked at the mercantile. She hadn't been working when the wilt came through, though, it seemed. She would be home, waiting for me. Our home was seated on the far end, the last house between the forest, the mines, and the river. It was small, but it was all we needed. It was white as snow now. The chimney looked to have collapsed away from the near side, leaving a gap that appeared like torn fabric in the wall. I looked back out over the town, tall columns of smoke climbing ever skyward. The girl had come closer. She was standing in the middle of the town, in the center of the street, not moving, just standing there, watching me. I moved in through the narrow opening, wilted rubble crumbling underfoot. Dust motes and wilted petals hung stagnant in the air. Most of the furniture had collapsed into piles. I moved through the small space, memories assaulting my mind. I saw us sitting at the table, holding hands, talking about our future together. I saw us huddled under furs by the hearth, soaking in the warmth of the fire and each other. I saw us dancing across the floor to a song that only we could hear, and laughing all the way. Now I only saw ash and dust. Searchers of the dead, they called us. But it was far worse than that. If it was only the dead we sought, this job wouldn't be so bad. Death was easy. But this... In the far corner, where a bed once stood, sat a motionless form. I moved closer, kneeling down in front of her. The head moved in a slow, jerking motion, fixing my form in milky eyes. A hint of the emerald green I knew so well still lingered. But not for long.
Atrem,
she croaked, her right hand trying to lift from where it sat in her lap, but the skin and bones crumbled away. I removed my mask. I'm here, my love, I strained to say, fighting back tears.
I knew you'd come back.
The faintest smile fought its way to her cracked lips. Try as I might, I couldn't keep the tears from streaming down my face, falling to a puddle in the wilt below. She tried again to raise her hand, the left this time. I reached down and carefully lifted it with reverence to my face. It felt cold and dry against my skin. Petals flaked away and fell to the floor. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, I whimpered. Her wheezes grew deeper, her milky eyes unfocusing, the last vestiges of green slowly fading away.
I love...
She struggled to say. Then she stared at me. Blankly. Lifelessly. The gods were cruel, and fate even crueler. My heart broke at that moment, and I let out a cry of pure anguish like I had never felt before. Her hand fell apart in mine. A sound made me spin around to see a form darkening the broken wall. It was the girl. Hatred could not even begin to express what I felt towards this creature. Are you happy? Is this what you wanted? I screamed. She made no noise. Near infinite black eyes stared at me, unblinking. Then her hand lifted slowly from her side. A small, vibrant red rose was held in between her small fingers. The kind that thrived in wilted soil. What kind of sick joke was this? Tears still in my eyes, I reached out and took the rose from her hand and sat back on my heels. She said nothing. She did nothing but stand there, staring with her hand outstretched. I slid back over to my wife, who was now staring wide-eyed at the newcomer. I tucked the small flower in her hair over her ear, then bowed my head in prayer. I didn't know who I was praying to. I didn't even know what I was praying for. Forgiveness, redemption, easy passing for a soul so terribly mutilated in a way only the wilt could manage. I sat back on the floor next to my love and removed a flare from my pouch. I met the small creature's eyes with a mix of hatred, fear, and confusion. Then I struck the flare on the floor, and it burst to life in red-orange light. All my searching, all my wandering, it all led back here. In my last moments, I couldn't help but wonder, would anyone search for me?
I awoke, stiff and chilled, but alive. My mind was fuzzy, as if I had been hit rather soundly on the head. I snuggled deeper into the damp yet warm furs, fighting off the sunlight, grasping for a few more moments of peace. Peace. I hadn't slept peacefully since I had become a searcher. Not a single nightmare. Not a single child crying out for mercy, or a swarm of shades closing around me. Nothing. It took me a moment to realize that I was completely naked beneath the furs, bundled tightly with large warm stones. My mind raced, trying to recall what had happened. Where was Atrem? I remember being cold. So cold. Then, nothing. But there was something else. A story. A memory of Atrem, holding me tightly, his body against mine. He had saved my life. I forced myself to sit up, despite my pounding head. I held the furs close to my chest. The tent was empty, so I stood up and dressed, then poked my head outside. A small fire was still smoldering a few feet away, a pot of boiled water sitting off to the side. Atrem must have set out all of our supplies to dry by the fire. But there was so little, only a few pieces of dried meat and bread. I scooped out a ladle of water and sat down by the fire, biting into a piece of meat. Beside everything else was a slate from one of our binders with markings on it. I reached for it and began to read.
Leren, I'm sorry for having to say goodbye like this, but you needed to rest. I boiled some water and prepared what was left of our food. We lost a lot in the river, but if you ration it out, it should be enough to get you home. There's only one more town on our list. My town. My home. You have been a great partner, but this is something I must do myself. The town we fled yesterday should hopefully be clear of shades by now, and you should be able to clean it up yourself without too much trouble. We should have passed by a bridge a league or so back during the storm. If you see that host again, just flee. It's not worth losing your life over. As you may have guessed by now, I'm not going to be coming back with you. My search is over, and there's nothing left but pain for me here. Once hope dies, the searcher is usually not far behind, and my hope has long since left me. I wish you didn't have to keep searching. I wish you could run away and never look back. I wish you could be free from the torment of possibility. But you're like me. You're not going to give up until you break your own heart, and I can't fault you for that. I'm sorry that I wasn't a better friend to you during our travels, but even with how distant I was, in the end I still hate saying goodbye. I hope with every ounce of hope left in me that you find your brother alive and well. Despite my seniority, I feel like you've taught me more in our short time together than I have you. You've taught me to be brave and bold, but to not take foolish chances. You taught me that it's okay to care, even if it hurts. I hope your next partner will treat you better than I have. Our scars make us who we are, but we don't have to let them define us. Make your own way, Leren. Pave your own path, and find what you search for. Tor Atrem.
The tears came to my eyes before I could even think to hold them back. I ran my fingers that had gained back most of their color over the slate. That foolish man! If he thought for one moment I wouldn't come looking for him. But he didn't. He knew I would. But he also knew this was a suicide mission. There wasn't enough supplies for both of us to make it back. Not that he would have made a different choice if there was. How dare he leave me out here by myself? How dare he not even give me a proper goodbye? I knew he was broken. All searchers got that way eventually, but could I blame him? After what he's been through? After what he's lost? No, I couldn't. He made his choice, and I had no choice but to respect that. Foolish man. I had no choice but to keep going, keep searching, even if by myself for a time. It's what I did. I was a searcher after all, and like him, I wouldn't stop until I found what I was looking for.